Cool. Jules, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Andy. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Last time we met, there was a monkey in the room.
Well, it wasn't quite in the room, but there was a. I appeared. I did a talk for your community, and I was in Costa Rica then. And as I was talking, a kind of horde. I don't know if horde is the right word, but a group of
Yeah,
howler monkeys went past my little house. And so I could turn the camera around and just, I don't know if you could see them, but yeah, they were
we
just
did.
going past. So this would happen every kind of couple of days. These monkeys would come and visit and make an absolute racket.
Didn't you say they're the loudest monkeys or animals in the animal
They are the
kingdom?
second loudest animal in the animal kingdom. I don't know if the elephant would be the loudest. So they do make a racket. That is true, and they smell.
That's
They at one time they kind of they went right right over me onto my roof, and so I can testify that they're pretty stinky.
pretty stinky and rather noisy. That's great to wake up to a howler monkey, but it was comical. And as I said earlier, the monkey did steal the show. As good as your talk was, I think we all fell in love with the monkey.
Uh,
I thought
yeah,
it
never
was
work with
beautiful.
animals. You know.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought where we'd start today is with a quote. And this quote changed my life. It was a quote from a book that I read 10 years ago by a guy called Anthony Robbins. And the quote was this: "It's not events that shape our lives, but our beliefs about them." That one line in his book, Awaken the Giant Within, genuinely changed my life. It was one of those sort of quotes that just gets into your bones. And it was so empowering to me to think, oh, I've got control. I've got control potentially over my beliefs about certain situations, which will influence my emotions and my actions. That was a game changer for me. And I followed that path and got really into self-development, and everything started to evolve. And then I read another book, as I always do, called Bounce by a guy called Matthew Syed, who's also a writer for the Times, sports writer for the Times. And he recommended your book. And I thought, oh, I'll try Philosophy for Life, your original book. That changed the game completely for me. And then I discovered in your book the wonderful Epictetus, and we can talk about whether I pronounced that name right in a second. And then I realized the origin of Anthony Robbins's quote, really, because he was re-quoting Epictetus in a different way, as he likes to do. And it was this: it was variations of "men are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them." And I love this sort of quote. And you just introduced me
Yeah.
to this whole new world I did not know existed. The origins, in many ways, of self-help, talk therapies was 2,000 years ago, the likes of these guys, Seneca and Epictetus, and just this rich, place of knowledge. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And why your book, Philosophy for Life, your original book, was a real gem for me and still is, probably one of the books I recommend most. So thank you.
Not at all. Thank you for recommending it. I mean, and yeah, like you, I went through a similar thing of discovering the incredibly accessible and powerful wisdom of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, and that this is stuff that anyone can understand
Yeah.
and that works from day one. It really works in people's lives. And I've written about lots of stuff since then. I keep on learning and exploring, but I also keep coming back to that wisdom, like every day. So I'm really glad if that book helped connect you to those thinkers, because that was the whole aim of that book.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, and it's just such a nice book to share because it's so accessible. Your story within the story is really relatable, and then you just open up to this world that I didn't know
Yes,
existed. So
treasure trove, isn't it?
it really is, and I've spent a lot of time since then, trawling through all of those books from Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and all these wonderful big thinkers. But what I thought we'd do, if it's okay with you, I thought we'd just wind back a bit and maybe your build up, your backstory to that moment of sort of losing a bit of control, as it were, and then you have this experience around a ski accident that just creates this sort of ecstatic experience. I thought maybe if we could
You're
just
giving
place
away the
that.
story now,
I
Andy.
know. Do you know what? I'm a nightmare for a spoiler. I did a live the other day just after
Yeah.
Line of Duty had finished, the day after, the Monday after Line of Duty had finished, and I
Yeah.
did a spoiler live on air, and I just went,
No.
"Oh no, I did." And
Oh,
I probably had a nightmare. I had to take it off Facebook. I was like, I can't handle that. I've just like destroyed Line of Duty for too many people.
Oh, so you
So
gave away who
I
H
did.
was.
Yeah, like
I've
accidentally.
missed all that. I was out of the country, but everyone went crazy for that TV
Oh,
show,
they
didn't they?
did. They did. So
Well,
yeah.
okay. So as you put it very well, actually, I don't really. But well, there's a short version, Andy, is that I when I was a teenager, my friends and I did. It was mid-90s, and so it was kind of acid house,
Yep.
electronic music, and we were teenagers, and we got into that and got into clubbing to kind of techno music and house music, and really started experimenting with drugs far too young. And I did LSD when I was 15 for the first time. I did MDMA when I was 16, and by 16, 17, I was going to clubs and doing, all kinds of drugs at the same time, and really going into really altered states. Then I was just too young to handle it. I mean, of course, for a while I kidded myself that it was almost like a rite of initiation. I was very hardcore. I was proving how tough I was, and my friends and I, that we could go to these incredibly far out places and come back smiling. But then, sure enough, friends started to mess up and have develop just emotional problems from like doing too much amphetamine or having bad trips or, this kind of thing. And then it happened to me. So in fact, like one of my best friends had like a psychotic breakdown on LSD.
Wow.
And got diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you just don't know whether it would have happened anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, I could see that my mental health was getting a bit worse as in my 18th year. I was smoking dope every day. I could just see my mental health getting a bit stretched. And then I had one LSD trip where I felt very blocked socially. I had a personality that was a real show-off personality. I loved to make people laugh. I loved to just kind of, impress people. Other people's approval was very important to me. And in this LSD trip, I just felt incredibly blocked and couldn't really think of anything to say. I mean, it shouldn't be a big deal, but to me, that was like kind of death, like to be socially blocked. And I felt, so that kind of hurt me, that experience, because also I didn't talk to anyone about it, didn't process it, didn't get any support for it. So it was kind of quite a blow. And then a few months later, that kind of thing happened again, but much worse, again on psychedelics. And I got very intense paranoia. I was with a lot of people I didn't really know, and I just got frozen. It was that kind of fear response where you freeze.
Yeah.
And I thought everyone there is talking about me. And, and of course, in my drugged state, this seemed incredibly important and incredibly bad, that, the situation. I felt completely terrified. And I remember I finally got the courage to get up and leave. And I went home and like lay in bed. And I just had this thought going through my head: you've done it now. You've blown it. You've damaged yourself permanently. And once again, didn't talk to anyone about it. Didn't talk to a therapist. Didn't tell my parents about it. Didn't tell anyone about it for years. I honestly think there was a chance that if I talked to someone about it straight afterwards, that might not have been that big a deal.
Yeah.
I might have just processed a difficult trip. But because I didn't talk to anyone about it, and just buried it, what then happened was that trauma, because I think it was traumatizing, kind of festered and came out a few months later when I was at university in the form of panic attacks, which was terrifying to me. No idea what a panic attack was. Mood swings, social anxiety, nightmares, dissociation and depersonalization, which is basically like you're just happily going along your business and suddenly everything seems incredibly unreal. Yeah. So basically the kind of trauma response comes back, like, dissociation is a trauma response. So I would just often get dissociated. And obviously I became depressed and socially anxious because I was like, what's going on with my emotions? I did not know who I was from one moment to the next. I didn't recognize myself. I did not have a language for what was happening to me, and I had no idea about what to do about it. So the big fear was that I've done something permanent. I've done permanent damage to my brain, and there's nothing I can do about it. And therefore, I've blown my life chances, aged 18. And this was on top of my background was a lot of expectation to succeed, and so there was a lot of shame and anger and despair at having possibly damaged my ability to succeed in life. Not just succeed in life, just to connect to other people. So because I had bad social anxiety, I couldn't, I could no longer really connect to other people or relate to them. Right. And I had so much shame around that as well, because my identity was all built around being popular and impressing other people. So really it was, this lasted for about 6 years. And by the end, I was a real mess emotionally and, all that.
Yeah, and you'd reach that place, I guess, like many people, of sort of misadventure in many ways, or this underlying, as you said, sort of pressure to prove yourself to someone. And I guess, like you said, there's that fear that, oh no, I've done it. Typical me, I've taken it one step too far. I'm forever broken, and I think that's an experience that many people have been through in different guises. But what's interesting, I guess, about your story is then how it starts to unfold, and there is this momentum towards, I guess, a sort of a new way of thinking and an enlightenment that leads you back to philosophy in many ways.
Well, I think, the momentum was down really. I had dreamt about, I wanted to be a writer, a novelist, or a poet. I'd done English literature at university, which now I just think such a strange decision, a career decision, study poetry and literature. But and then I was so messed up by the time I graduated that I ended up in a job writing about mortgage bonds, which was like the last thing I wanted to do. So I think I was a kind of walking cautionary tale over, don't mess around with drugs or you end up writing about mortgage bonds, which just wasn't my dream. Yeah. And I had real, this is my first job. I was in this office. I had really bad social anxiety as well. So I really didn't get on with the people I worked with. I think I really annoyed them because I was so anxious. I was just giving off waves of anxiety. And then, so I was really stuck. And then I just had this weird bit of luck, which I don't pretend to understand. But every year my family would go to this place in Norway, and I had a Norwegian ancestor who built a hut, hytte, they call it in Norwegian, beautiful place overlooking a valley in the kind of middle of Norway. And on this occasion, on the first day, I and my cousins decided to ski down the kind of hardest slope on this mountain, and it was also quite bad visibility. And I went through a fence on the side of the steepest part of the mountain and flew off a cliff.
Wow.
And fell, must have been about, 20, 30 feet, and landed and broke my femur very badly and 2 vertebrae and banged my head. And the weird thing was that at the point of impact, I'm just remembering this from 20 years later, but I was immersed in a white light, and I felt totally fine, totally filled with love.
Yeah.
And I felt this very strong insight, you could call it a message, which was that what was perpetuating my suffering was not screwed up neural chemistry, but my beliefs. And that I could, the belief you are damaged and people will never like you, or the belief that you must have other people's approval or you're a basket case. And I realized that I could let go of those beliefs, and that there was this kind of light in me and in all of us which is just kind of indestructible and wonderful and can't be damaged. Not only can it not be damaged by accident or death, this is the impression I had, but it can't be added to by praise or achievement. It's just, it's our kind of soul. And so it was this wonderful, just, and I honestly don't know what that experience was. It lasted about a minute. And then I kind of realized, I came back and I was in my body. And I remembered where I was, and I realized I'd been in an accident. And I wiggled my toes because I thought, I wonder if I've paralyzed myself.
Yeah.
And I could move my toes. So then I knew, okay, you've broken your leg. You haven't paralyzed yourself. You're going to be fine. And I remember my uncle kind of skied up, and he saw, I was a mess. I had a bone sticking out through my leg.
Ouch.
And he said, oh my God. And I tried to say to him, everything's great. I've just had this experience, but I remember it came out as kind of gobbledygook. I think probably because I'd banged my head. But I swear that from that moment on, I just knew that something wonderful had happened to me. And I was filled with like love, because for 5 years or so, I've been in all this kind of cycle of self-loathing and then distrust towards others, paranoia, resentment, and suddenly I felt reconnected to myself and able to be open and loving towards other people. Nothing to prove to you or to anyone else. So able to just relate to other people with openness and love.
Wow.
And also feeling like, maybe that even death is nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah. So
this lasted for about a couple of months.
Well, and I'm interested in that, even if I jump in there, because I read Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle, and he talks about similar experience that he had, and it lasted about a year. Same thing, same sort of realization, not an accident in this example. But when I read that, I'm a bit like, I'm not sure about that. And then I hear it from someone like you that I admire and trust and really enjoy your work. And it's really, really powerful, just to let you know. And I'm really intrigued and interested in this. And I can't remember if it was you that even said this to me, that lots of people actually have versions of this, or, a spiritual experience or something they can't quite explain, or it feels ecstatic in some shape or form. A high percentage of people experience that, but barely anyone talks about it, which I thought was really interesting.
Well, that's true. Lots of people have some variety of mystical, spiritual, ecstatic experience. There can be all kinds of triggers for them, from just a certain moment and they can be also on a continuum of intensity. So, you can just feel really relaxed and at peace and at one with your environment going for a walk. You might not classify it as a mystical experience, but then so these things happen, all through the day. And then certain moments, like you might have a very where you're really in an altered state, or because you just feel so, connected to your environment, connected to other people, something like that. So that might be in, say, childbirth or in war, in these extreme situations. But it might just be sometimes when people are at rock bottom. So like, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous would talk about that. And then it can just be for no obvious reason. But in terms of near-death experiences, quite a few people who get resuscitated having died talk about, report a similar kind of thing, like an encounter with a white light. So there are kind of similarities, and they often come back not less afraid of death. And sometimes they feel like they have some kind of, they feel more interested in spirituality. Obviously you wouldn't you? So I have to say that I don't really, I thought about watching this documentary on Netflix actually just last night about near-death experiences. It's funny we're talking about this. And for some reason I wasn't that interested, just didn't feel like it. But I mean, it is pretty bizarre and interesting. And I suppose what's very interesting as well is you'd think that if you've fallen off a cliff and banged your head, your brain would be scrambled. And yet that moment was very clear to me, and I got very useful information in it. You know what I mean? You wouldn't expect that.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when you have a fever, you don't get useful information. You
No,
get
it's a
kind of
struggle.
junk info. So this was really high quality information, which subsequently proved to be useful. So anyway, I don't pretend to understand it, but I suppose here's the important point, because in some ways, how is that experience helpful to other people, right? Okay, you know, lucky me, I fell off a cliff and had a kind of reset. Okay, great. But the point is that two things, right? First of all, is actually that high did not last. And you know, it's not like, unfortunately, unlike Eckhart Tolle, you know, I don't remember that experience intuitively. I'm no longer connected to that white light. And I've always been interested about how to try and get back to it, but I haven't managed to. But what happened was that high passed, and the old habits of anxiety and depression came back.
Right.
So I realized that I needed a more kind of daily practice to turn that insight that I got from that epiphany into kind of daily habits. So the bit of that experience that's really useful is the insight it gave me that what was causing my suffering was my beliefs.
Beliefs, yeah.
And that I could change my beliefs. That's the bit that, you know, I mean, obviously it's nice to remember, you know, sometimes like, do you remember that experience? Like, you know, do you remember how you felt that you didn't have, you know, nothing you could do or achieve would actually add to your value or take away from it? And also, don't be afraid of death. Like, in the back of my mind, I tell myself that, but it's right in the back of my mind.
Yeah, but the practical is the information around beliefs, which I guess
that is exactly what Tony Robbins was saying. It's exactly what Epictetus said. Yeah, that is something that you can use every day, and you don't have to fall off a mountain to actualize it. Yeah. So
and that, I think you're so true. Even for me, it wasn't a white light experience, but it was so powerful. It was the same insight, but in a book, in written word.
Yeah.
Like I said, I described it. It was in my bones. Again, a variation of, but that insight, I think, is so powerful, and it was so beautiful how it came to you in you know, as you said, in a moment when you thought your brain would be scrambled. It produces this like incredible insight. I mean, isn't that just fascinating as a standalone thing? Like, where does that come from? What is that all about? And that's why it's so lovely to hear you articulate it, because it's a difficult thing to articulate, but it's also incredibly exciting. And I know even on a similar level, like you said, there's many gradients to this. There's been moments in my life, definitely, when I've walked it in nature. Always happens in nature. And I turn a corner, there's a meadow, the sun's shining on my back, and you just know there's something bigger at play here. You can't put your finger on it, but there's just a sense, you know. And again, I think, like you say, that for me feels like a spiritual experience. That for me has connected me to something bigger on occasions. And I think you're right. I think it's nice to talk about these things and try to articulate them as best you can, because I think it's really important.
I agree. I think it can be annoying when you hear people talk about it, because they can claim a kind of special knowledge. Do you know what I mean? Or a special status. Like, I had this experience and now I know that, you know, Jesus is Lord, or I know that Mama Ayahuasca loves me. You know, and actually I now, you know, I consider myself like an agnostic, even though I believe that there's a lot more than what we know going on. And there are, I guess I do have the sense that there are powerful spiritual forces which sometimes intervene in humans' lives for the good. And I'm not sure about for the bad, but I'm sure about for the good. But I'm also feel like there's a real limit to our capacity to understand that level. And in the meantime, you know, let's get on with life and trying to help each other and trying to help each other live well. And I don't want my spiritual beliefs or experiences to stand in the way of me relating to someone who has different beliefs. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I you know, your community where you help all these people, you don't say, you can only come into my community if you believe A, B, and C. You know, if you believe in a Trinitarian God, or you believe in, you know, the cosmic elephant, or so. that's why, that's. But at the same time, there shouldn't be a taboo against talking about our experiences.
Exactly, and I think you do it beautifully. That's what I mean. It makes it comfortable to talk about these things. And what I think is interesting, again, about your story is that philosophy, in many ways, is this practical, pragmatic, quite secular philosophy for life, isn't it? And it makes it really easy to talk about these things because it's like, look, this stuff is really practical. There's no stigma around it. Whereas as soon as you stray exactly into these other areas, it does get much more difficult to talk about these things, and you have to really frame them carefully. Otherwise, people are looking at you like, hold on, is he trying to sort of drag me into something that I don't want to be a part of? Whereas philosophy is like, this stuff's brilliant. Just go and read it. It'll change your life. And I think that's your
true.
early experience that led you there, wasn't it? And maybe you could even talk about your path from there to philosophy. That would be brilliant.
Yeah, sure. So I knew I was kind of coming down from this, epiphany, and I knew I needed a systematic daily way to create new habits. In psychology, they talk about going from altered states to altered traits. Yeah. So the altered states is like mountain epiphany. Altered traits is being a different person in a steady way. So different personality traits. So and I kind of intuitively knew somehow or other that cognitive behavioral therapy would be helpful for me. I knew that cognitive behavioral therapy was based on this idea that what creates our emotions is our beliefs, and that we can, it gives us techniques and practices to change our beliefs. So I, by that point, I guess I had, I think I was a member of an online social anxiety support group. And someone said, we're setting up a new CBT support group for people with social anxiety. So I went along to this support group, and that we did a CBT course. That was really helpful to me in understanding my social anxiety, understanding how my anxiety was connected to my beliefs, and giving me practices to change my beliefs, change my mood, change my behavior. I was very impressed by cognitive behavioral therapy. In 2007, I went to interview the people who invented cognitive therapy, two American psychologists, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. I did the last ever interview with Albert Ellis before he died. I interviewed him on his in a hospital in New York, and got to thank him for inventing this therapy, which helped millions of people. And I asked them, where did they get the idea for CBT? And they both told me that, working separately from each other, they both come across the Stoics, ancient Greek philosophers.
I love it.
And particularly, they've both been trained in psychoanalysis, in Freud's psychoanalysis, but they felt that it wasn't really helping their patients, even though they were seeing them sometimes every day for years. And so particularly Albert Ellis was the pioneer. He looked around for other ways to understand the mind and the emotions and how to heal it. And he came across that quote by Epictetus that you mentioned. People are disturbed not by events, but by their opinion about events. And that turned a light bulb on. And he understood, instead of focusing on the subconscious and on childhood and, primitive Gothic impulses like the Oedipus complex, which was kind of Freud's perspective, focus on what people are thinking here in the present moment, on their beliefs, their attitudes, their interpretation of events. Sometimes those beliefs and attitudes might be somewhat unconscious. Yeah. So there is a role for the unconscious in CBT, but it's about what you're thinking now, about your habitual interpretation now. So that got me reading the Stoics. That got me reading Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Epictetus's Discourses, Seneca's Letters. And like you, and then also reading things like, actually just really got into ancient Greek culture in my 20s. I got into like Plato and Aristotle, and even the playwrights like Sophocles. I never learned ancient Greek, but I got into the whole culture. I was like, and I was, just blown away by the wisdom there.
Oh, it's stunning, isn't it? And I must admit that you took me on that journey with you through Philosophy for Life, your book. But And then I've explored it far and wide and fell in love with it. And there's a word, arete. I don't know if you're familiar with that word, but it means to find your meaning and purpose and achieve excellence in life.
Yeah.
I love that word. I'm using that word now to drive, I think, my own life. This beautiful word I'd never heard of before from ancient Greece. There's so much to offer. It's just
and
stunning.
their lovely word eudaimonia, which
Yeah.
is their word for flourishing, but it literally means having a good relationship with your daemon or your kind of guardian angel.
Yeah.
I love that ancient Greek culture had a relationship between the rational and the non-rational. So it was both the birthplace of rational liberal democracy, the birthplace of rational medicine. Hippocrates was a kind of contemporary of Socrates, the birthplace of rational history, Thucydides, all this stuff. But it also had these like ecstatic cults as well. Had, the psychedelic cult of Eleusis. Every great philosopher was an initiate there, the kind of mystery cult of Eleusis. You had the cult of Dionysus. You had the followers of Dionysus running through the woods, the Maenads. So they had this balance, this integral idea of human nature, the day side and the night side. And, it wasn't just rationalistic. It was about understanding human nature as a whole. And as a part of that wonderful thing, they had these different schools of philosophy. They had Plato in his academy, which is where we get the word academic. You had his student Aristotle and his lyceum, which is where we get the word lycée.
Yeah.
You had the Stoics teaching in a particular street in Athens. That's why they're called the Stoics, because it was called the Stoa Poikile, which was like the painted colonnade. That's what it means. So they would teach there. Epicurus living in his garden with his followers, the Cynics living in a barrel. And you could go to these different schools and all of them said, we can teach you how to flourish. This is a way of life. So you could follow the Epicurean way of life, or the Stoic way of life, or the Cynic way of life. These were designed to be ways of life and to be therapies for the emotions. So Socrates said, I teach people how to take care of their souls, which is where the word psychotherapy comes from. It literally means care of the soul in Greek. And like Buddhism, they had an arsenal of practices. They didn't just say, take care of the soul. They gave you methods, daily methods for how to take care of your soul. Like asking yourself questions is the most basic, the Socratic method, to bring your unexamined beliefs or assumptions to light. You might assume no one likes me. And the Socratic method would be like, is that definitely true? Is there evidence for that? Have you tested that out? Is there a different way you could look at that situation? I'm a complete loser. You might very much hold that belief. Is that definitely true? Let's examine that. Let's just, hold that up to the lights. Is there a different way you could look at that situation? Practices like the journal they would use, like, Seneca says at the end of the day, find a quiet place and write down, what have you done that day? What have you done well? What have you done badly? Count the number of days on which you manage, say, not to lose your temper. Count the number of days on which you manage not to drink any beer, right? This is a kind of basic technique for kind of changing your habitual behavior. They used visualization practices, like imagining yourself from the perspective of the universe. They would zoom out, a cosmic perspective, so that you don't make a mountain out of a molehill. They would also see that, see your life from the perspective of time. Think about all the people that have lived and died before you, as a way, again, to kind of not get too worked up about stuff. You know what I mean? To see your life from the perspective of deep time. Also, zoom in. Like, if you're really, going over the past or worrying about the future, just narrow your attention. Just focus on the present moment. Seneca says, all we have is the present moment. Why bring up suffering from the past? So they were amazing. You could think of them as like film directors. Like, if your perspective affects your emotions, then you can learn to choose your perspective, like a really good film director. Which lens would be really helpful in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's so powerful. And even those exercises that you just touched upon there, they're
Yeah.
at the roots of so much of modern day self-help and talk therapies, aren't they? All of those skills, from visualization to
Yeah.
understanding what's really under your control, all of these things have had such an influence and really are rinsed and repeated throughout the last 2,000 years in many ways. And what I always find astounding is that if you think back to Seneca and Epictetus, is that we've evolved so much. You know, we've flown to the moon and back. We're about to fly to Mars and back. So we've evolved so much materially in terms of technologically, but as a human race, we've gone nowhere. We're struggling with the exact same things that they were struggling with 2,000 years ago. And I think that's what makes it so relevant, isn't it? And it's so up to date. It's like you're reading something that's like, this is written for me now in like the modern. In fact, there's an argument to say, and I'd like your view on this. I think why there's a big turn back towards Stoicism right now because of the uncertain times that we're living. I think people are finding these philosophies incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And it really, when I see friends and loved ones or myself struggling with, mental illness, it really makes me sad and angry that we haven't got further, that we are still often strangers to our own minds, despite, as you say, the kind of amazing technological achievements, controlling matter, controlling the external world, but we are still often strangers to our own minds and have still no idea how to steer them, and crash around and use bad means to steer, like use booze or opiates just to turn down the noise, just to make it bearable to live in our minds. And so that really does, I don't think we've got that much further than ancient wisdom, than the wisdom of the Greeks, like Stoicism, than or Buddhism, or kind of Hindu practices, or Christian practices. Now, why there's this extraordinary revival of Stoicism in the last 10 years, really. And though I don't consider myself a card-carrying Stoic anymore, though I did perhaps precipitously get a Stoic tattoo, quite a big one. On my shoulder, and I went into a tattoo parlor. It was 10 years ago, and it was just when I was writing the first book, and I thought, I'll get a tattoo, that way I have to finish it, because I'd written books before then which I hadn't finished. And then in there, the tattoo artist said, do you want it a bit bigger? And he upsold me, so I said, yeah, go on, then make it bigger. So now I've got it's really pretty garish, and I'm not even really a card-carrying Stoic anymore. But there you go.
What does it say? Is it?
It says logos. It says logos. Yeah. Right, and it's kind of flame, but it probably looks like a garlic clove, really, right?
Yeah. Now it's aged a bit.
But what was I going to say? But yeah, nonetheless, I'm proud to have played a role in this revival of Stoicism, because it's extraordinary, right? Yeah. I mean, if this was a cryptocurrency, it would have gone up like 100%. Like, so I remember 10 years ago, I helped to organize the first gathering of Stoics in California. That was when I got the tattoo in 2010, and there was only like 10 of us then. And we still managed to fall out. By the way, there was a schism in because some were atheist Stoics and really atheist, and some were theist Stoics and really theist. But my friends thought it was incredibly eccentric that I was going to a gathering of Stoics to celebrate Marcus Aurelius's birthday, which was in April. It was the equivalent of saying, I'm just off to hang out with some Pythagoreans at the pub. It'd be like that. But now it would not be so weird. Now there are like tens of thousands in Stoic groups on Facebook and so on. And every month someone comes out and says, I've really discovered Stoicism, particularly during the pandemic. There's Stoic blogs, podcasts, videos. It's a Stoic dating app.
Is that really?
Sounds like a really bad idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one.
You're like, can you imagine? Just like, do you want to go out with me? I mean, I don't care.
Yeah, exactly. We never get anywhere. I'm not sure that one's going to take off. But even you're right, and the likes of Ryan Holiday, I'm sure you're familiar with them, and Tim Ferriss, and
exactly. Some of these, exactly. And I'm really pleased about that. And of course, like once something takes off culturally, it mutates in all kinds of unexpected ways. And of course, there will be some aspects of modern Stoicism, which some people might find a bit of a turn-off. So there's the fact that it's very popular with tech millionaires, right?
Yeah.
And that can be a bit off-putting, like reasons why you can't change, like to accept the limit of your control. In other words, don't pay taxes or whatever. So sometimes people call it broicism, when it's like tech bros who are like, oh, we're super rational, and then there's in one dark corner of the kind of stoisphere, there's an overlap with like white supremacy groups, right? I mean, I was invited to talk about stoicism on a white supremacy podcast. Wow. And I was like, wait, and I kind of Googled and was like, I'm not going on that. Yeah, but so there's people who use stoic techniques for investing or to win at poker, which is not what Marcus Aurelius had in mind, So it just mutates in unpredictable ways. But on the whole, I'm really happy about it. And I admire the people working in that field, people like a friend of mine, Donald Robertson, who gives out a lot of stoic stuff for free, like online courses and so on. Yeah. So I'm, even though I'm working on other things now, I'm excited to see that cultural evolution.
Yeah, it's been a really beautiful thing to be a part of, and I was introduced to it quite early on through your book, and felt like we've been sort of a bit of ahead of the curve. And then Stoicon, I saw you speak, and obviously having read around it and see that evolution, and you see it, and it feels quite mainstream, and it's one of these things that's easier to talk about. It doesn't seem as slightly strange, like you've rightly put before. But equally, then what I noticed about your story as it unfolds a little bit, because there's something missing a little bit from Stoicism and practical philosophy of that nature. And it almost is this sort of slightly bigger spiritual element, I feel. It's very pragmatic. And like I said, it makes it very comfortable and easy to talk about. But then I sort of noticed your story start to unfold a little bit more, which leads you to, I think, was it Holidays from the Self? No, that's more recent, wasn't it?
The Art of Losing Control. The Art of Losing Control was the second one. Yeah, I mean, so I've got great respect for Stoicism as a philosophy, but the reason it wasn't enough for me, it wasn't sufficient, it wasn't my end point, was I find it too rationalistic. I don't think it's open to, we have multiple states of consciousness.
Yeah.
And the different states of consciousness have their use. So like dream states, trance states, ecstatic states, and so on. And sometimes different practices and different states of mind can get to different levels of consciousness. So our rational consciousness is just the highest level. And sometimes it's possible to change and heal the self at other levels. For example, through the body. Like, just going for a run can be a great way to change your emotion, or dancing, or through things like trance states or hypnosis, or through ecstatic states. So that was one reason. I also find that Stoicism can be overly individualistic.
Yeah.
It lacks community, and I think it can be a bit unhealthy in its emphasis on self-reliance and on independence. It is very much about a bit like kind of turning yourself into a fortress of reason, and not really being dependent on anyone else. So this is the thing you get a lot in like Epictetus and so on. Like, make yourself invulnerable to fortune, and part of that is don't depend on anyone else. And this was helpful for me as I was healing from social anxiety, because I learned to need to just be self-reliant, to not need your approval, and to not fear your judgment. But after a certain point, I actually needed to learn to be able to depend on others. And I needed to learn interdependence, not independence. I also needed to learn how to make attachments, because when you've been traumatized, you basically don't really make attachments. I became a very self-reliant Stoic. That was how I got through trauma. But I was lonely. I wasn't able to make relationships. So I realized I needed to learn how to make attachments. And part of that was learning actually not to be invulnerable, but learning to be vulnerable. In other words, I had to learn to take off my stoic armor and allow myself to be hurt, which means learning to care for other people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and
And
I think that's
and learning to the cost of love is that sometimes you're going to be hurt, and you can protect yourself from that hurt by like being totally self-reliant. But I think that's too high a price to pay. And I guess I learned, instead of like seeing anxiety and pain and discomfort as something to be avoided and shut down as just something bad, it's like it's the price of being human. And rather, learning to build up my tolerance for anxiety and suffering and pain, and go, oh, hello, anxiety, welcome.
yeah,
So more, I suppose, in some ways, I guess I see Buddhism as a philosophy that has a massive similarities with Stoicism.
yeah,
Sometimes when I hear Buddhist talks, they could be talking about Stoicism. But I feel that Buddhism has, because it was a living tradition for 2,000 years, unlike Stoicism, that branched out into many different cultures, I think it's got a much richer tradition. It's got a place for ecstatic experiences. It has an understanding of the importance of things like, love as well, and dealing with negative emotions, not as something that is just bad. Stoicism sees negative emotions as just bad, as failure. Whilst in certain Buddhist traditions, negative emotions are just energies to work with. They're not bad. They're just, you can learn to relate to them and transform them through acceptance. And that to me is more powerful, transforming through acceptance rather than saying, stop negative emotion. You are irrational,
yeah,
do you know
and
what I mean?
breaking it down. Yeah, and I had the same experience, exactly the same experience. That's why it's been really interesting for me to see your story unfold through your
Yeah.
thinking, really, through your books, because
Yeah.
I was really drawn to Stoicism in those early days, and I needed that as well to get me through, and taking a break from alcohol and changing lots of things in my life. And it was such a valuable tool, and it always will be, and it is. But equally, there was something missing. It was that building that pure fortress that was indestructible, and you could literally, it
Yeah.
reminds me of James Stockdale wrote that
Yeah.
amazing book about
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
philosophical fighter pilot, that sort of indestructible, who was shot down, I think, during the Vietnam conflict, prisoner of war, and used all the teachings of Stoicism to survive, physically and psychologically, in the most horrific, tortured and beaten for years and years and years. Like, in that place, it was that fortress. You cannot take my one last thing. That's my beliefs, my freedom. I get it, and it's powerful for that, and I think that's why it serves such a wonderful purpose. But equally, like you say, at some point, you've got to be vulnerable and open yourself up to love and the world and all of those things. So then you almost can't hold those two things together. So
Yeah,
I've had a
exactly. I
similar
think
experience.
it's a defensive philosophy,
Mm.
and it's quite a pessimistic philosophy. It's a defensive posture, and extremely good in a crisis. And that's
Yeah.
why the book was called Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations.
Yeah.
It was for dangerous situations, but life isn't always a crisis.
Yeah.
And as I changed and grew, I just knew I just could tell that it had served its purpose for that time. And so in my second book, The Art of Losing Control, the way I approached it was, there's this other side to human nature, like the non-rational side,
Yeah.
and there are non-rational approaches to healing. And so the book was really about the ecstatic, and it was a kind of a bit of a history of the ecstatic. Ecstasy as in moments when we stand outside ourselves, our ordinary selves, and feel connected to something greater than us. And it asked, how do people find ecstatic experiences in modern Western culture? When is those experiences good for us, and when are they bad for us? And it was a funny book to write. I mean, because that's a big old topic,
Yeah.
and and I did my best to it, and like I was also searching myself to try and find ecstatic experiences. So the subtitle was A Philosopher's Search for Ecstatic Experiences. And I was not only trying to find them, because anyone can, you can just sniff glue. I mean, but I was trying to make sense of them. And I suppose I was also like looking for that, to get back to that kind of white light that I talked about, and make sense of that. So in some ways, I was looking for God, really. And, right at the start of the book, I kind of started my journey by looking at Christianity, not just any Christianity, but like ecstatic Christianity. I was dating a Christian at the time. I was fascinated by her faith. And what was the difference between it and Stoicism? Stoicism, you have this idea of the logos, the cosmic intelligence. Christianity, you have this idea of, God the Father, who loves you and is there for you. And then Jesus and the Holy Spirit and miracles and all of that. So that's very different. And then you've also got the community of church is very different from, a Stoic Facebook group. You go there and pray with each other and sing together, weep together, heal each other. And, I was fascinated by that. And I was attracted to that because, I'm a chronic individualist. So I'm a kind of lonely seeker. So I was like, community, how enticing. And so I got into that, and I ended up having like ecstatic experiences, one in particular in a weird little church in Wales, surrounded by like ecstatic grannies passing out. And I converted to Christianity that night.
Did you?
And announced it to the world.
One of those, I've sort of seen it, I guess on the screen where you
Pentecostal
sort of
type experiences.
No,
I didn't walk up front. I was far too English to do that. I was right at the back of the church, but it kind of felt like you got zapped, like it was like that.
Wow.
It was a bit like John Belushi in Blues Brothers, if you ever seen that.
Yeah.
It was like that without the backflips, but it was literally quite similar to that. I mean, there wasn't a ray of light, but it was like kind of, and it was very somatic, and it kind of took my breath away. It was like being kind of, pierced, and it was kind of joyful. I remember I looked at, I went to the loo, and my eyes were like I was on ecstasy. My pupils had dilated. And, it was like that. And really, and so I converted and I announced it to the world, and, half my subscribers to my newsletter kind of unsubscribed. They were appalled. They were Stoics. And it was really difficult. The next year was really hard because, again, what happens? The high runs out. The epiphany passes, and in this case, it no longer made rational sense to me.
Right.
When the high had passed, I just couldn't. Personally, I couldn't accept the theology that I was being presented.
Right. Okay.
And so, my faith wore away. It was like a Vegas wedding. I'm sorry to say that, because it's very disorientating.
Yeah.
Because this was in the middle of writing that book. And then, so I ended up in a kind of agnostic pluralism, like saying, I'm not sure what that white light experience was, and I'm not sure if it'll ever happen again. It was quite a sad book in a way. But, at the very least, I kind of ended up in this position. Well, look, people have these experiences, and sometimes they're good for you. So we shouldn't be so afraid of them. And I suppose where it ended, the book, is saying, don't be afraid of these experiences. They are natural. They happen. On the whole, they're good for you. On the other hand, don't get attached to these experiences, which is what happens in ecstatic Christianity and what happens in New Age spirituality, is people get very attached to ecstasy and hung up on it, and they start to chase it, as I suppose I was. And where can I get that experience again? Or maybe I'll go to this Tony Robbins seminar, or then maybe I'll go and, go to this breathwork thing or whatever, and that's unhealthy too, because now I'm like, particularly after this ayahuasca retreat, which I guess we can talk about, I no longer chase ecstasy. I no longer chase the ecstatic. Like, and I realized it was a bit immature of me to do that, and that like it's not about big experiences. Like, life is about, I don't know, it's big and little experiences, and the everyday as well. And like those kind of experiences come along sometimes, but you shouldn't really target them. I feel like,
deliberately go after them. And just coming back to that, because it's really nice to hear your sort of concluding wisdom around that in the ayahuasca. And what for me is interesting about that, for you going out of your way to actually go back into that environment, is that your personal history with psychedelics and drugs and mind altering states clearly kickstarted this whole, thought in your mind that maybe you've broken and all of that, and you've worked incredibly hard and all these wonderful years to get into this place, and then you were willing to sort of potentially step back into that lion's den, as it were, and go through the ayahuasca ceremony.
So I went to an ayahuasca retreat. Ayahuasca is a psychedelic potion that tribes in the Amazon jungle have been drinking probably for hundreds of years. It's made out of two plants, and they worked out that when you mix these plants together in a potion, one of the plants contains a psychedelic called DMT, which is a very powerful psychedelic. The other plant contains a chemical harmine, which extends the experience of DMT for 4 hours. So clever indigenous tribes, they worked out, if we mix these two plants, we can take a 10-minute DMT trip and make it last 4 hours. So since over the last 20 years or so, Westerners have been discovering ayahuasca and going to the Amazon and drinking it, and sometimes drinking it here in the West as well. For the Art of Losing Control, one of the chapters was on psychedelics. Psychedelics are the most reliable way to get an ecstatic experience. You take LSD or MDMA or ayahuasca, you know that you're pretty much reliably going to get some kind of ecstatic experience. Something's going to happen, and for that chapter, I wrote a lot about the new research that has been coming out in the last 20 years about psychedelic therapy.
Yeah.
A lot of research now into that, and into how psychedelics under careful, guided conditions can be very healing for people. In other words, very different to the kind of experiences when I did psychedelics, throwing them into my system with people I didn't know at some warehouse rave, without any kind of mature intention or without guides. So that really, got me interested in psychedelics again, and interested in the potential of psychedelic therapy to help me and heal me, because I guess I was trying to improve my capacity to love, really. Stoicism had helped me and made me self-reliant, and, healed me a lot of my social anxiety. But I was trying to open up and improve my capacity for like intimacy and a relationship. I was like 39 and really had barely had a relationship. So that was the motive. I thought the psychedelic therapy might help me at that deeper level. And I very carefully picked the place to do it. I picked this retreat center where you would have both indigenous shaman and Western therapy facilitators. Because I expected it might be a bumpy ride for me. I thought some trauma might come up. And so I knew that I wanted therapists there who could help me with that. So I went a lot, and I did it after the book had come out, because I thought there was a chance I would go crazy, and I didn't want to have to do a book tour if I was psychotic.
Right, okay. Well, it's never a good thing doing a book tour.
Yeah. So after the book had come out, it was after my 40th birthday. I went to Peru, and I did a 10-day retreat at this place called the Temple of the Way of Light. And it was absolutely extraordinary. I wrote about it in this little book, Holiday from the Self. And, just extraordinary. you're kind of, there's so much one could say about it, but you're drinking this potion in this kind of large wooden hut in the jungle with like 20 other people. I hadn't thought about the group aspect of it.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. And we kind of would appear in each other's visions.
Really.
Oh my Lord. I
And
mean,
just and speaking to
we
that
felt very
before you,
connected. Yeah.
and just because a friend of mine, before you get into it, a guy called Ollie Ollerton, he's a SAS or SBS guy, star of SAS, Who Dares Wins. Anyway, he had this unbelievable trauma when he was a child. He was attacked by a chimpanzee at a fair his mum and dad had taken him to, and they just sort of took their eye off him for a second. He'd strayed towards this chimpanzee who was chained up but grabbed him and started attacking him, was beating him to death effectively. He fought off this chimpanzee. But you can imagine, you're 8 years old, what a traumatic experience that is, that stayed with him forever. And he went just recently and invited me to go. Actually, on the next time they went to do a ceremony, same thing with a group of veterans that all had PTSD, and they all went for healing perspective. And he literally talks about this experience, and it is mind blowing. When he, someone that you know and trust like that, and basically what happened for him, not only was he seeing other people that were in the group in his vision, but he ended up seeing through the eyes of the chimpanzee. And he knew then it was really, really powerful for him. He knew that chimpanzee was just acting out of love because he had a little baby.
Yeah.
He had a baby, and it was terrifying. And it wasn't him that he was attacking; it was just protecting. I'm getting goosebumps even thinking about it. It was like, whoa, when you hear someone, it's rocket fuel.
Wow. I mean, that was what persuaded me. There's a line I interviewed someone in the Art of Losing Control, and she said, ayahuasca is like a laser guided Scud missile that goes right to the source of your problems and anxieties and traumas. And it is like that. And I described it, I think, in The Holiday from the Self as, imagine a kind of virtual reality machine that you plug into that summons up your worst fears, and then react to your emotions and to your mental state in real time, so that you can confront it and transform it, and integrate it. And then imagine that you're also plugged into the machine with all the people around you as well. So there's that kind of strange thing going on where the group mind aspect of it is mind blowing, because that's so strange. You know what I mean? And then, then there's the musical aspect to it too, because then there are these shamans that come around and sing songs in front of you. And the songs are their medicine, whereby they call in different spirits of plants to heal you. And these songs are eerily beautiful. And of course, the moments when they sit in front of you are the moments of most powerful intensity. Another weird thing is it's like a purgative. So the word catharsis, right? Like the kind of purging. So you will have these, you bring up stuff from your subconscious, from your past, and then you purge it, either through being sick, for example, or needing to go to the loo, or like, it's very somatic as well. Or like, I remember like sweating it out as well. So all of that's going on. And then this is something that grows just wild. This is not like a computer. This is a plant. This is an incredibly intelligent plant. So that really, the two things that really blew my mind were, first of all, the experiences of group mind I had. That really is undermines your sense of a separate self. I was getting telepathic and, knowing what was going to happen even. So that's unnerving, to be honest. And then the other thing that blew my mind was the idea of plants being intelligent.
Those just where to go.
That's just fundamentally different to my model of reality. And so I found that experience good, but it was also there was one. We tripped 5 times, and one time I drank this stuff, and I just immediately went out of my body. And I couldn't remember where I was, who I was, that I was a human being, what my name was. And for about 5 minutes, I was like somewhere else, but not in any kind of pleasant way. And I was like, oh God, I've really done it. How do I get back from here? Where am I? And then, and then I was like, oh, I'm a human. Oh, I have a body. Oh, I've done ayahuasca. But that was unnerving, but anyway, on the whole, I feel that experience was very healing for me. But here's the interesting thing that happened. I expected my difficulties to come up during the retreat.
Yeah.
And they did. And I processed them and I confronted them and all of that with my training and so on. And with Stoicism actually was properly helpful to me, and Buddhism was properly helpful to me. Things like maxims, things like reminding myself this will pass, the breath, all of those were super helpful to me. Then what happened was we came back to the town of Iquitos, the nearby town, after the retreat. And when I was there, that was when the old trauma really came back.
Wow. Right.
It came back after the retreat. Like my heart, which had been incredibly open, incredibly connected to the other people there, kind of froze shut, exactly like it happened to me on my bad trip when I was 18.
Right.
And everything felt very unreal. Time felt very unreal. I felt nauseous, very cut off from other people, couldn't think what to say. And I thought, fuck, and I remember Googling integration, ayahuasca integration, and like, how long can this last? And the website of this place, the Temple of the Way of Light, said integration can be a difficult process and can last for days, weeks, or even years. And I was like,
oh, no.
Years, like, oh my, and I went off It was my plan to stay for a week in the Galapagos Islands and to do my integration there. So I thought to be surrounded by nature. And on that journey, and by the time, I was so dissociated, and that trauma had come back so strongly that I thought, I'm not in normal reality. I decided I was either in a dream or in some kind of afterlife, because I was so dissociated. I thought, this isn't normal reality. And you can imagine, I got to the Galapagos and I thought, how do I wake up? How do I get out of this? Because this lasted 3 days.
Wow.
Like, I'd go to sleep, wake up, and still think I'm still in this dream.
Still dreaming, yeah.
Yeah, and every time I get a text from like loved ones, I'd be like, oh, that's just my subconscious creating that.
Ooh.
And how do you get out of that situation when you're in it, And so a friend of mine said, look, you don't sound well. I think you should come back. And I thought, maybe if I go back to England in my dream, I'll wake up.
Wake up.
Yeah, because I thought I was maybe in like a coma or something like that. So I took a journey, took 3 planes all the way back to England, all the time thinking, this is my dream.
This is still a dream, yeah.
Like this air steward, So I upgraded to first class on the plane because I thought,
might as well.
It's not
a dream.
It's not real money. Yeah.
It's brilliant.
So I said, here, take my credit card, no problem,
Yeah.
Take the dream money, and then landed back. And it was a long, strange journey. All kinds of strange stuff happened to me on the way. By the way, I won't go into it, but finally got back to London, and there my friend was waiting for me. It was like the last scene in Inception. Yeah. Have you ever seen that film, Andy?
Yeah.
So like Leonardo DiCaprio comes out into the airport and he sees his kids, and he's not quite sure if it's a dream. Has he woken up? And he decides to go with it, to go with whether it's a dream or not. And it was like that. I saw my friend and I hugged her, and as soon as I hugged her, I realized, I knew I was back in reality. Yeah. Just the smell of her hair, her face, the smile. So in other words, love is what kind of connects us when we're
you back.
Yeah. But you can imagine that was a pretty strange experience. And so I was none the worse for it. And in fact, in the next kind of few days, it was a funny kind of replay of my bad trip when I was 18, because I was still incredibly dissociated and out there for about a week afterwards. Couldn't really understand books, couldn't understand films. I mean, I was quite cognitively disabled, probably freaking out your listeners here.
Yeah, but, I'm just thinking, it's important that we see both sides of, because it starts with this really powerful experience.
Yeah, so and I had to depend on my friends to look after me, and they did an incredible job. at taking care of me and looking after me. And after a week, then I was completely back on earth, as it were. And so in a way, it enabled me to process the bad trip of when I was 18, where I had not talked to anyone about it, where I'd refused any help. And this was like a replay of that, but in a very different way, where I had to depend on others. I had to be open. I had to rely on other people. Do you remember I talked about learning to be dependent, learning to be vulnerable? So it was that experience forced me.
Full arc almost of coming back.
Yeah, it forced me to be dependent on others and to be vulnerable. But it also, I mean, just to kind of end the story, really, like, it got me interested in this thing called spiritual emergencies, which are basically spiritual experiences which are messy. We can think of spiritual experiences as always like happy, la la la, fairy lights, you know, wonderful. But spiritual experiences can be frightening and disorientating. This is true of psychedelics. This is true even of yoga and meditation. People can have experiences through yoga or meditation, which are very powerful, but disorientating because they go beyond their ordinary self, their ordinary reality. And it's a bit difficult to go back to their ordinary self. So that kind of experience has been called spiritual emergency. It can feel like psychosis, but it isn't exactly, because it's a temporary experience which can be managed and navigated. So I and a friend of mine, we put together a book called Breaking Open, which is basically 14 people's stories of their spiritual emergencies and what helped them through them. So what helped them through these messy spiritual experiences to integrate them and to kind of go on with and have flourishing lives, basically.
Yeah.
So that's probably put you off ayahuasca now, Andy.
Yeah. No, I'm scared enough as it was. Margot with Ollie, he'll look after me. He's a big tough guy, just in case it all goes wrong. But no, it's wonderful to hear these stories from you. I think it's really important. I think people will be fascinated and interesting about all of this. And like you say, leading to the latest book, which was Breaking Open and Spiritual Emergencies, which is another great read. Just while we're on the subject of books, a couple of questions. I'm conscious of your time. The book that you're working on right now, I'm really interested about that, about Aldous Huxley. Would you just give us a quick snippet of what that's all about?
Yeah, sure. So it's projectively titled, well, maybe I shouldn't say the title, I might jinx it. But, it's about the Huxley family. Aldous Huxley, his brother Julian Huxley, their grandfather Thomas Huxley. They were an extraordinary family, and it's about how they reimagined religion after Darwin and helped to create a kind of post-Darwinian future religion. Or Aldous Huxley called it like the human potential movement. His brother Julian Huxley called it transhumanism. But it's about how they kind of were religious prophets for the 20th and 21st century and imagined the future of religion or spirituality in this kind of synthesis of science and spirituality, imagining the evolution of human potential from humans into kind of almost like superhumans. And so it's telling that story through the Huxleys and their friends. They were friends with everyone from like H.G. Wells to D.H. Lawrence to Krishnamurti to Timothy Leary.
Wow.
Telling that story from the 1850s, like Thomas Huxley was like Charles Darwin's right-hand man, probably the most famous scientist of the Victorian era. So the man who did most to Thomas Huxley to introduce the theory of evolution into Western culture, all the way to the present day, into kind of Silicon Valley and Californian people, and you know, the dreams of transhumanism that you have today in Silicon Valley. And it's telling that story. It also looks at the kind of the dark side of it as well, which is the idea that humans are evolving into superhumans, or rather some people are, like a kind of avant-garde and elite are becoming superhumans, whilst other people are like lesser humans. So it's warning about this tendency to elitism and also sometimes eugenics, you know, like kind of classifying humans into like superhuman and subhuman. So really it's saying this is kind of like you know, I guess I love the Huxleys, particularly Aldous Huxley, and that kind of spirituality is my spirituality.
Mm.
But it's saying, look, it does have this dark side as well, which we need to watch out for. This tendency to elitism, and spiritual inflation. You know, I'm a super being, and you're not. You know,
Yeah.
so it's saying, watch out for that.
Yeah, and I think it's just someone that I'm really starting to get more and more interested in is Aldous Huxley. I first heard about him actually in a book, The Structure of Magic, which actually is about the origins of NLP. And they
Oh
actually
yeah.
quote Aldous Huxley a lot in that book. And that was a name that kept coming back. And I loved the quotes. And then I heard you talking about it. So
Ah,
I've actually,
interesting.
yeah,
I
purchased a
didn't
couple
know
of
that.
his.
I knew that Aldous was a friend of Bandler's,
Yeah,
and
that's
that
probably
and
right.
he learned hypnosis from him and would try it out on his friends. So he was a pretty good hypnotist. He had a friend, the Igor Stravinsky, the composer, who had
Yeah,
insomnia, and Aldous cured him with hypnotism of his
hypnosis, really.
insomnia. Yeah, I mean, so he knew, his family knew everyone. I mean, like it's like a who's who. So you can, it's a kind of group biography. It's just, you know, I mean, it's just fascinating the people they knew and influenced. Like, you know, Esalen. Maybe you heard of Esalen. It's kind of,
No.
oh well, it was a big place in the '60s up to the present day, and it's in Big Sur in California, and it was like the birthplace of the human potential movement. So you
Right,
can still
okay.
go there, and they would do courses on everything. Like you could do a course on shamanism. You could do, you know, then a weekend thing on ecstatic dance, which that came from Esalen. Gestalt therapy,
Right,
encounter
okay.
groups, meditation, psychedelic therapy. A lot of these things came from Esalen. And Esalen was inspired by Aldous Huxley as well. I mean, and it was, you know, the two guys who founded it were basically inspired by Huxley. So he also co-coined the word psychedelic. That was him and his friend Humphrey Osmond. They came up with that word together.
Right.
Um, you know, I mean, look, I could talk.
Yeah, well,
That's another podcast to
that
do.
is
You know,
another podcast. It really is,
yeah.
because I'd say and to note that he was friends with Bandler, so he must have been really influential on their thinking behind NLP. That's why he's quoted in all those original books from 1975. Those books are,
You
no
know,
doubt.
I hadn't read that. I knew that they were friends. I knew they'd written a paper together, but that's inspired me to go and read that because I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it's the first quote in the first book, and this is the quote. I'll just read the quote if that's okay. To
Yeah,
make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out the other end is a measly treacle of the kind of consciousness which will help us stay alive on this planet. The doors of perception. Aldous Huxley. Love that. And that's when they're talking about basically
exactly.
how we filter information through our brain, and what we're actually dealing with is this tiny slither of actual reality. So I think he had a huge influence over the NLP movement as
That's
well.
so interesting because that explains, you know, someone like Tony Robbins and that kind of
Yeah,
80s end of the human potential movement and
exactly.
how it's connected to Aldous in the 50s, that there is that kind of line of connection through NLP. So that's very interesting for me. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, good. You can put that in the book.
Yeah, I'll
Slip
put
it
that
in
in the
there
book.
before it goes to publish.
Yeah. Yeah.
So apart from the new book, which we don't know the title yet, and we'll definitely do another a podcast around that if you
Yeah,
would,
great.
because I think I've absolutely loved this whole episode so far. What can we do to find out more about you, like right now, as it were?
Oh, great. Yeah. So I've got this website, philosophyforlife.org.
Yeah.
On there, you can sign up for a newsletter. I've got a free weekly newsletter. That's the easiest way to kind of keep in touch with me. I'm on Twitter, Jules Evans 11, Instagram, Jules the Philosopher, Facebook, YouTube. Um, yeah, I mean, I've got something called the London Philosophy Club, which I run, which you can join. That we do events on there. Um, then I've got four books out. So Philosophy for Life, Art of Losing Control, Holiday from the Self, which is a quote by Aldous Huxley. He says about we all
Is
need
that right?
holidays from the self. Yeah. So he talks about ecstatic experiences as holidays from the self. And then finally Breaking Open.
Breaking open.
Yeah.
Oh, marvelous.
So yeah. Mm.
Fab. And again, just to thank you for inspiring me and opening me up to so many new and wonderful ideas, and just been brilliant today. I've absolutely loved every second of it. Thank you, and we will do this again very soon.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for your really positive energy and all your work. I was thinking, I've got this podcast with Andy now, and I knew that you just got such great energy that would be my like afternoon cup of tea.
Yeah.
Just talking to you would be fun. So
Yeah.
great to see you.
Yeah, and you, my man. All right, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll see you again soon.
Brilliant. See you.